This is a map of housing discrimination. These areas were recorded by the government as 0% Negro, 0% foreign-born. It was even prohibited to sell homes at prices that poor people could afford. You might think this is a city in the Deep South. It's not. It's LA. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was finally passed amid intense pressure in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King. We're going to get into its fascinating history, explain how a rule that went unenforced for 40 years is responsible for a lot of the problems we see today, and introduce a new bill that Abundant Housing LA is proposing to help fix them. First, let's go back to the map. The government employees who made these saw excluding minorities as a good thing. They advised banks to make home loans in these areas. The term for this, you may have heard, is redlining. On the other hand, areas reserved for minorities were often near polluted sites or further away from jobs. In the 40s and 50s, some of these restrictions were struck down by courts, but discrimination by property owners was still legal and common. California voters even approved the ability to discriminate in housing in 1964's Proposition 14. In 1966, Ronald Reagan campaigned for governor, saying people should have the right not to rent to black people. That was only changed when the Fair Housing Act was signed in 1968, which finally made it illegal for property owners to discriminate. But there's a critical third process that determines who can live where: planning. As cities grow, new housing is needed, and city governments plan where it goes. Those old exclusionary neighborhoods were typically where the city's most powerful residents lived, and they vocally opposed any new housing, particularly less expensive apartments or public housing. To this day, the most engaged residents in these neighborhoods tend to oppose housing, even as the reasons cited have shifted from racial ones to overcrowding or worries about neighborhood character. As wealthy areas have continued to block sufficient housing, prices have continued to rise. And exclusionary zoning has continued to perpetuate segregation even after racial segregation was made illegal, by making housing there unattainable to higher and higher shares of the population. Meanwhile, new housing has disproportionately been built in working class areas where people register less opposition to housing because, well, they're working. Historically, the city has been less likely to put public investments in these neighborhoods and more likely to, run a freeway through them. Most people would agree today that if you were looking for housing in the 1930s and you were systematically excluded from the most desirable neighborhoods and forced to live in ones with poor public services, that was unfair. But if today you are looking for housing and forced to look in marginalized areas because exclusionary ones have blocked new housing for decades, that's the same result. Now, the Fair Housing Act actually saw this coming, which is why it included a key provision to affirmatively further fair housing. This told cities they must overcome existing patterns of segregation by allowing more housing in wealthy ones, investing more in disadvantaged ones, etc. However, for 40 years after the Fair Housing Act, the government didn't enforce it. It was not until 2015 that the government began requiring cities to do it. And in 2018, California began requiring cities to report the actions they were taking to do it. Unfortunately, UCLA researchers have found that still today, these actions fall well short of the need. The actions cities report are often low impact, like updating a city website to include more information on small business assistance programs. Overcoming patterns of decades of segregation is a big job. Not sure that's going to cut it. The actions often have no timeline, little budget, and don't actually change where new housing is built. Plus, cities have no plans for evaluating the effectiveness of these programs. This is why Abundant Housing LA is introducing a new bill, Assembly Bill 2667. Here's 3 big things it does. It requires cities to publish annual numbers on where housing is being permitted. It requires a standardized format for cities' plans to promote equitable housing, so they're easier to compare with each other. 3, it requires cities to analyze affirmatively furthering fair housing before they decide where housing is permitted, not afterward. The bill's goal is to require cities to analyze where the new housing they're permitting is actually going and push them to open up exclusionary areas. It's a key step in making sure the Fair Housing Act finally fulfills its vision. And you can help. This bill is up for key votes in committee and needs your support to become a reality. Follow us, Abundant Housing LA, to get notified when it's time to contact your state representative in support. Hopefully this year we can make crucial progress on making California housing fairer for everyone.